let me tell you about this match between Rodolfo Cardoso and Bobby Fischer. In fact, let me go back to the intro screen. As you can see there, a picture of the young men. Keep in mind, a junior champion could be anyone as old as 21. So we have Ambassador Carlos P. Romulo of the Philippine Islands making the ceremonial first move. And then we have Morris Steinberg, vice president of the Manhattan Chess Club, Florencio Campomanes, and on the right, John Rhodes, the vice president of Pepsi-Cola, and they were hosting this little match. Now, if you're not familiar with the name Florencio Campomanes, you can count yourself fortunate, I suppose. Quite a corrupt individual. I'll let you Google him. Well, what we have here are the Filipino junior chess champion and the United States junior chess champion playing in an 8-game match. Now, what you may not know about Cardoso, besides the fact that he was Philippine champion in 1958 and 1963, but he also won the Asian Zonal Tournament in 57-58 to become an international master. He also became eligible to play in the Portoros Interzonal Tournament that year. He didn't do too well in the Interzonal, but his game against David Bronstein was a wonderful upset, and it actually kept Bronstein out of the candidates tournament for that year. But as wonderful a victory as it was, Cardoso actually regretted it because Bronstein was a big hero of his. Now there's a sportsman right there. Well, another thing you may not know about Rodolfo Cardoso. By the way, he passed away in 2013 at the age of 75. But it is Cardoso who first discovered Wesley So when Wesley So was but 9 years of age. Quite a discovery indeed. Now, let's come back to the chessboard and look at this first round game, which was played September 6th, 1957. The match was held, by the way, in New York, as you could probably guess. I mentioned the president of the Manhattan Chess Club. Well, we have E4, and I hope you like the Sicilian defense. These two fellas had quite a few Sicilians. Now, knight f3, of course, here. D6 by Bobby Fischer. D4, and we're going to get an open variation. We have pawn takes the pawn, knight takes the pawn, knight f6. Now knight c3, pawn a6, of course, is your Najdorf's variation. But after bishop g5 and pawn to e6, we actually transpose to a Scheveningen variation. Scheveningen being one of the districts of The Hague over in the Netherlands. However, after pawn to f4, I think this transports back to Najdorf's variation and bishop e7, queen f3, pawn h6. Now, there's another book move that's more common than pawn h6. Let me show you that line. It's the traditional line with queen c7. The traditional line continues with queenside castles, queen's knight to d7, pawn to g4. This is the main line. Pawn to b5, bishop takes knight, knight takes bishop. Pawn to g5 hits the knight, sending it back to d7. And now pawn to f5, inviting bishop takes pawn. That's check, forcing king to b1. And knight e5 hits the queen. Queen h5 hits the bishop. And we retreat our queen back to d8 to defend. So that is the main line. Coming back. Not as common is this line with h6, but it is a book move. And after bishop to h4, we have the Göteborg variation. Now, Göteborg is Sweden's second largest city. King Gustavus Adolphus founded Göteborg, also known, by the way, you've probably heard it called Gothenburg. King Gustavus Adolphus founded this city by royal charter in 1621 as a heavily fortified, primarily Dutch trading colony. The Göteborg variation, pawn g5. Pawn takes the pawn, and now the king's knight comes to d7, getting out of harm's way. Here Cardoso went ahead and queenside castled, but the book move is a remarkable knight takes the pawn on e6. Of course, the most common reply here is pawn takes knight, and the purpose of this sacrifice is to give a check with queen h5, forcing the king to f8. The next remarkable move in this line is bishop to b5, which is awarded a double exclam. Now the common move is rook h7. You don't want to take this bishop because that allows, and look at the eval bar lunging, that allows rook f1 check, and you'd have to block with your bishop or your mated. Any of these moves, and the queen zips in for checkmate. So white's getting his material back with a big attack. So instead, back, we don't take that bishop. We play rook to h7. And then kingside castles gives check, and king has to come to g8. And there are, obviously you can just hit this rook. It has to come over. And there's a lot of initiative for white in this line. Here we actually trade the bishop off. He comes in with a big hit here, threatening checkmate. That has to be taken, and that has to be taken. And the final piece gets into the party as well. And your only real move here is to block with the bishop. So, quite a line. Let's come all the way back. I had to show you that full line because it's quite an interesting and exciting line. Anyway, Cardoso didn't play in that direction. Knight e5 hits the queen, and he played queen to e2. Now, that blocks the bishop, which is no doubt why it gets a question mark. So, queen to f2 being suggested. Now, you should also reject this move, queen to h5, because that will allow bishop takes the pawn with check, and after a trade of bishops, which is pretty much forced, we'd also have to trade queens. So the best option is, in fact, queen f2, keeping the line open for the king's bishop to come into play somewhere. Queen e2, however, was Cardoso's choice. So now pawn takes the g-man, hitting the bishop, bishop to g3. The queen's knight comes to d7. And actually, white, I know the eval bar's dead equal, but I feel like white in this is slightly better. His king is safer. Yeah, it's going to be a while before this bishop can become active, but black has the same problem with his queen's bishop. The difference is black does not really have a good side to castle to. So he's pretty much relegated to the center. Now, he does have refuge that he can take in the midst of these pawns, but it can be a challenging situation here. So if you're a computer, this is equal, but most of us would prefer the white side here. So now queen e1, pawn b5, pawn a3 to prevent pawn b4, bishop b7, very thematic. This rook will come to the c file. Knight comes back to f3, and that's going to win if bishop takes knight can be played because of the piece relationship between white's rook and black's queen. This pawn's really pinned, isn't it? So for that reason, queen to c7 gets out of the rook's line of fire. And queen to d2. The bot calling for king to b1. I'd like to get this bishop out of the way, even if it's just one square. I get a thumbs up for that. But queen to d2, knight takes the knight, pawn takes the knight, and now knight e5. Bishop takes the knight here, gets a big question mark. Bishop e2 being called for now by the bot, which certainly would have been my choice here if I hadn't played it sooner. Pawn takes the bishop, and now knight a2 is a curious-looking move. King b1 surely would be advisable, getting out of the queen's line of fire. I'll be honest, I'm not sure what the real purpose of this knight move is. Perhaps he wants to put the question to the dark matriarch. I am not real clear. Let's play it through and see. Bobby plays rook to d8, hitting the queen. The bishop d3 obstructs that attack. Queen b6. Now finally king b1. Pawn f6, shoring up the center, but creating some weakness there on the light squares, especially on the e-man here. I wondered if rook h4 might be a move here. I get a thumbs up for this. But pawn f6 was Bobby's choice, and now queen g2. That gets the big red X with h4 being called for. King f7, declaring why he played f6, and queen back to e2, curious. If you're going to put something back on e2, perhaps you should use your bishop and put the question to the rook, although that's not liked by the bot either. Well, queen to e2 it was. Bishop c6, pawn c3, pawn a5, bishop c2, pawn b4, a takes b, and bishop b3. Bishop b5 hits the queen. Do not take. It might feel tempting to discover an attack on the bishop with pawn takes pawn. But that fails, and I hope you see why. I'm playing bishop takes the pawn check. Double exclam! Oh, yeah. And you cannot take me with the king because queen c4, yeah? So you'd have to flee to g7, and then the knight can pick up the pawn at the end of it when the smoke clears. So a nice double exclam for Coach Daniel there. Bishop to b5, hitting the queen. Pawn c4 blocks. Bishop back to c6. Rook takes the rook, and rook takes the rook. Now pawn h4 is played. Not liked here. g4 from Bobby Fischer gets a star. I was looking at rook h8. I get a star as well. On rook h8, he can play h5, and I'd have to bring my king over to super attack or super defend, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, worse would be pawn takes pawn. That would not be the right way to go. In fact, it gets a question mark, because now rook takes the pawn, and you have to bring your rook over to interpose after, well, actually, I think I'll actually flee rather than interpose. Star. And right, I mean, we already saw an arrow. White can reintroduce his knight through the c1 square, can't he? Okay, coming back. So we don't want to play that capture. Bobby with g4 gets the star. Pawn takes the pawn. Now rook to d2. What a move. What a move, ladles and jelly spoons. And the purpose is to decoy the queen away from this pawn so that a fork can be played against the king and the rook. Anyway, queen did take, bishop did take, check. Bishop interposed, and bishop took the rook. Now queen h6 looking for an attack here. But that gets the double question mark with knight c1 being called for. Knight c1 is surely answered by queen d4, I'm gathering. Doesn't like it, says pin the knight. Well, the point here is after the queen trade, the knight can come to d3. And this looks equal. Let's come back. Queen h6 is not as good as it looks because queen g1 is check. And now knight c1, you probably should interpose with the queen, to be honest. That gets a star. Well, I mean, if he interposes with the queen, I'm trading queens. And whether you take with the knight or the king, I have an advantage. Let's go back. Well, knight c1 was played here. And, of course, queen takes the pawn on g4. Queen h7 check. And queen g7 interposes. Even though the queen is defended by the bishop, no doubt allowing that trade would be winning for black. So Cardoso tries queen h5 check, king f8, bishop a4, super attacking the e8 square, and of course that would be checkmate. Bobby's not going to allow that. Instead, he plays bishop e4 check, and Cardoso with the king to a1. Now, whether the king goes to a1 or a2, the arrow indicates a2, the bishop is still coming to g6 in either case, and then the queen will have to flee somewhere to safety. But king a1, frowned upon, and sure enough, bishop g6, preventing the queen from accessing the e8 square. Now queen to d1 was played, queen h6, queen e1, queen f4, bishop b3, queen e4. Bobby ready to trade queens if Cardoso is willing, and he complies with queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, bringing us to a two-bishop versus bishop knight endgame. Black is up a pawn, but he's got this mass of passed pawns here, strongly favoring the black side of the force here. Bishop to d1 and pawn to f5, king to a2, pawn to f4, knight to e2. Black is just gonna bulldoze white from here. Bishop d3, king to b3, pawn to f3, knight to g3, pawn to f2, bishop to c2, and there's your new queen. Knight takes, bishop takes, and after bishop e4 and king to g7, Rodolfo Tan Cardoso resigned the game, being a full bishop down. Let me give you the numbers here. Pretty good game. Black certainly got the better of that game, but both players played a great opening, and the middle game was quite well fought. But the end game, of course, was all black. Bobby, 94.8 accuracy. Cardoso, 88.5. Single game ratings, 2750 for Bobby Fischer, 2500 for Rodolfo.